live now, so welcome everybody to Character, Stakes, and Conflict. I'm Amy Ogden. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer and the co-editor of Translunar Travelers Lounge, and I have some lovely panelists who will introduce themselves to you here. Stuart, you're first in my view, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. I am also a science fiction writer. I'm a regular in Analog Magazine, a winner of the Writers of the Future and the Jim Bain Award. And I believe you are also Amy, right? Am I not confusing it? Yes. So I know a little bit about characters and stakes, I hope.
AT, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Hi, I'm AT Greenblatt, or Lisa, either one works. I am a short story writer. I've had stories in Uncanny, Nieces Skies, Clarksworld, have stuff coming out in Tor.com, and yeah, a lot of good places. I won a Nebula Award for a short story, which is super exciting last year, and I'm up for another one this year, and also Hugo for the first time, which is I'm super excited about. So yeah,
Cool.
it's been a good year. Yeah, that's me.
And then Diana?
I write, I'm Diana Farrow Francis. I write fantasy. I used to write traditional fantasy more, but now I write more urban fantasy, and I'm sort of dabbling in romantic suspense because, it's fun. And I've got, I don't know, 18, 19 books out.
And Danny.
Hey, I'm Danny Lohr. I am both a prose and comics writer. Right now, primarily what I'm doing is comics. Done some creator-owned stuff as well as some, superhero and other licensed work like Champions and James Bond, as well as having done some both editing and writing prose. And just a heads up for anybody who's watching, today is a jittery ADD day, so if you see me with the crocheting, it's because I need to do something with my hands to hear everybody. And that's just the way it works today.
Legit.
Yep.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning. What usually comes first for you, characters or plot? And once you have that initial spark of an idea, how do you work from one to the other? Let's start at the other end this time. Danny, do you want to go first?
Sure. So usually I want to say neither and both, because what happens is I get the vision of like a beat or a scene. So it's not even a full plot or story. Say, for example, one thing I'm working on, I just knew that it was the like a wizard archetype, but I imagined him like trying to like mac on a character and it getting him in trouble, and like just that energy, right? Or another story where it's like, oh, I get a flash of this character in this room, right? But I don't necessarily know what the plot is or what the character is at that point. So what I usually do from there is I kind of come up with a plot and a personality that gets me to that point. Like whether or not that, then sometimes that scene gets cut, but like it's like the impetus for what I'm doing. And then usually what I enjoy doing is really learning about the character as I go on with a story, if possible. It's a little different in comics because I do a lot of like license work, and also with other people involved. I want to be more sure of what I'm doing when I'm doing comics. So I need to know for sure more things before I start a comic project than with prose. So I usually kind of know the character personality, like I know what the plot is and most of the situations I want to put them in there.
Is that because it's harder to make changes once you start doing artwork?
Yeah. So pretty much as a rule, I don't want to be making any changes once it's at art artwork. Maybe I do it during layouts. But the logic is as little as I can change once it's in my once a collaborator has done their next stage. I try not to change it. So after art, I will do a pass with dialogue, right? So like I will, to make sure things get done, sometimes I'll make a note that I'm like, I know that this dialogue is not great. I will, once I have the art and I have like the energy of the art, I'll go in and do it. But I want to change as little as possible once the letterer has put that art, that dialogue into place, because I don't want anyone to have to redo their work if possible. My logic as a writer is, considering what everyone else is doing, it is easiest for me to change directions than it is for anyone else to change directions, especially on, and also just frankly, I'm on a deadline. Like I tend to be on harder deadlines with comics than I am with prose, so I can experiment. I tend to notice in novels I'll re-outline halfway through, when I'm like, oh, I know this character. Can't do that usually on a comic. I've already gotten approvals, like from editors, etc.
Sure.
Yeah, Diana, how about you?
Boy, it's such a big question, isn't it? And every project kind of begins differently. I often start with an image in my head of a person or a person in a situation, and I start asking, things like, how did they get there, and why are they there, and what do they want? And I know a lot of people tend to go for the what are they afraid of right away, but mostly I'm in the middle of what's their problem and how are they going to solve it, and then what about them complicates the situation, right? So I'm in the process right now of trying to outline a story that kind of came up to me, that kind of popped into my head, and I don't know the character yet. And so I can't figure out the story really until I know who the person is, right? And she hasn't been very forthcoming. I've talked to her, but she's very, very resistant. And I do talk to characters in a sense. I will, in order to get to know them, I will conduct interviews in their voices, and that surprisingly works very well for me. But I don't, I don't say, who are you and what do you want? I tend to do the, um, what do you think of that guy sort of questions, and make them talk about each other in their voices. I do a lot of character discovery in the first 20 to 30,000 words of a novel. So often I end up doing the same thing. I re-outline or restructure the story after I get to know them better. I think I know them when I start, but I don't. And I'm trying to give up that idea that I need to know them super well before I start, because I know for a fact I discover a great deal more when I actually start writing, because I discover through my fingers more than I discover just thinking. And so, like probably all of you, I do a lot of writing down, brainstorming, writing in journals, and taking notes and things like that, because I find that when I'm actually writing down the ideas, more comes to me. And so, yeah, I tend to start with the idea of a character, but then I have to ask, what's the problem and why are they having trouble solving it? What's their damage? What's their uh what are their, and I like to write characters who are not necessarily loners, that have community, because I'm very fond of writing a lot of community dialogue and interaction back and forth. So then I have to figure out how do they fit in the community. And I think that's the problem I'm having with this one character, is I know who her community is, but she doesn't like interacting with them very much at this point, and I don't know why. So I've been, again, brainstorming, writing things, go out and garden and think things through with my hand. I'm kind of like you, I knit to keep thoughts going, because if I have my hands going, then I tend to think better. That's
What about you, Eliza? What do you think?
Well, I'm similar to Diana, where I also usually start with either like a voice or an image, or like sometimes it's just this like a glimpse, like a picture, and I work it out from there. It's usually accompanied by a mood. So sometimes the character will kind of have one line of dialogue or something that will stick with me, and it'll be the engine that starts the story. Or sometimes there'll be an image of someone um, standing in front of a house they don't want to go into with a hand on the door. And so I start asking questions from that point. But for me, a lot of it's driven by character, even if I don't know the character very well in the first draft. Like I I when I write a first draft, one of the biggest critiques I've always gotten is like I don't get your character. They're just moving through the story, which is always a little bit strange to me because they know in my head they know what they're doing. It just takes me a while for them to let me know what they're doing. Yeah, so it's kind of a hodgepodge for me. Uh, I tell people stories are not just one ideas; they're like five glued together. So, for example, this new story I'm working on now, I started the image of a gray city that um, has, I guess, bits of time shifting happening, and people in different places and times all kind of piling in here. But then I was talking to a friend a couple weeks ago saying, you haven't written a character that isn't very voicey. So what happens if you have a character who's narrating but doesn't have a strong personality come through? I'm like, okay, cool, I'll try it here. And yeah, I'm figuring out the story from there. I kind of have people coming in, so but we'll figure. I have like, and then I usually have a point where I want it, like an emotional point I want to end on. So I don't quite know how the story's gonna end, but I kind of know the arc and direction. It's more of a feeling. It's not even, I can't even put in words what I want. So yeah, that's a very convoluted answer for
Complicated question. And
yes.
how about you, Stuart? Where do you fall on that?
Well, I think I do kind of what Diana said, but in reverse. As a science fiction author, I very often start with the technical premise, and then I start looking for. I'm one of those authors. I believe that science fiction should be about more than just an adventure or a cool idea. It should be about something philosophical or something like that. So I'll try to think at the same time that I'm coming up with the character, what is the theme of the story going to be? And then from there, I'll usually work out approximately what the ending is going to be, like Eliza was saying, and then I back everything else into it. And one of the things in particular that I make a point of doing is I want especially my protagonist, to be a good fit for solving the problem, but I want them to have something that's a big strike against them so that at least part of what they're fighting is not the external environment, but themselves. And a perfect example of that is I've been writing these open source space stories for Analog, and one of my leading characters is an astronaut who's afraid of heights. And it's because being open source space, it's all stories that play off this new kind of commercial space. So you can have people become astronauts who aren't the classic, white cis male, big, strong jawed guy. This is a woman who became an astronaut because she could fit in the spacesuit that was available. And then she got up there, and in a later mission, it turns out she's kind of kept it a secret that she's afraid of heights. And so it lets me explore things that I wouldn't be able to explore otherwise.
Kind of tying back into something that Eliza said, how do you know that you have the right protagonist for a story? And have you ever had to like re-outline or rewrite a story around a different character? Does anyone have any experience with that? Just put up your hand and I can call on anyone who's suffered through that. Danny, what was that like?
So part of it, so like one of the things that happens it happens in my original stuff, but happens a lot in licensed, is that when you're doing license work, a lot of times you are designing that the pitch you give has assigned characters, right? And you would think that that necessarily means that, like, oh, that character is always the right fit for your story. But I've actually had moments where, when working with an editor, we realized that I was trying to tell the wrong story, either for those characters or that part of their arc, right? So, like, and this especially happens, like, um, something that people don't see when they're thinking about the writing characters they really love professionally, or like superheroes, right? Is that we all have those parts of those characters that are the reason why they resonate with us, right? Some parts of their arc, some parts of their character. But sometimes that means that when you're coming off a previous arc, that they're at a place where you can't tell that story, right? And you think that they can, because for you, that part of their personality is such a big part, you know. I'm not going to get into details, but that was part of the issue of not an issue, because obviously it worked out, but my first pitch for the Champions book that's about to come out was absolutely the wrong story for this moment, right? It wanted to deal with certain elements of character that were, frankly, for where they are, 3 steps ahead or behind in character development, like depending on the character, right? And so what I often go back, when Scott Snyder was first starting to write Batman, he said something that really stuck with me, not just for comics, but in general, is that when he writes a Batman story or any character, he thinks about what he loves about that character, and then he goes, how can I make a story that takes it away? And I don't think he always meant it literally, but like it is a thing where you go, what is the central thing of this story, of this character right now? What's important to them? And how do you make a story either about it or about the lack of that? You know, if they are a tech heavy person, can you tell a story in which either the tech is too hard, or it's magic, or, you know, like you take away, you know, their budget, you know? If a character is known for being the center of a community, can you put them in a community that they don't fit in, or do you remove them from that community, you know, like and so basically what ends up happening for me is the sign that is happening is about at the halfway or 3/4 mark, right before you start building up the climax. Suddenly you just keep hitting walls, and the reason you're keeping hitting walls is because there's something in the story that it doesn't make sense for that character to be in that situation. That there is something missing in the development of either the story or the character that you've set up. And it's almost always the story for me, because I'm really dedicated to, like, I care deeply about like doing like this character and this voice over a certain plot. Um, that they're lost because you lost something about who they are in the story. And my solution for that is usually a emotional arc outline. So I'll take each scene and write it out, and then do a chart, sometimes in Excel, sometimes by hand, of each character. Like, so say the whole, like, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And then underneath in each scene, I'll describe where they started in the scene emotionally and where they end in the scene and why. And look to where it becomes harder and harder to figure that out. And then I rewind not to that scene, but 2 scenes before it, because I almost always find out the seeds for that problem were slightly earlier than you can tell. So that's just how I do it.
Cool. Anyone else have anything to add or been in a similar situation? Yeah.
Well, I actually really changed protagonists, but I've changed points of view, which is always kind of a pain when you realize you're using the wrong voice for a story, depending on when it happens. Like for my story Annette, which was published in Uncanny a few years ago, it started off as first person, and I kept trying to make it work in first person, and then as I was like doing the 0 draft by hand, I found myself writing in the second person, and all of a sudden when I decided to switch to second person, the voice just worked. I was like, okay, hopefully my beta readers won't kill me for using second person, and it stuck. I've also had a problem where I tried to have multiple points of view sometimes, and one voice is much more compelling than the other, so I either have to go back and make the other voices just as compelling, which is a lot of work. It usually requires a lot of drafting on my part. Or in the case of like the story heavy lifting, where I just gave up and made it all one point of view instead of three, which is fine. It's what the story needed, and I always tell myself I'll go back and write the other story with 3 points of view, use different characters and settings and stuff like that. So, but I've never had a full character shift yet. See what happens.
One of
Some,
the sorry,
no, go ahead.
Stuart. What I was gonna say is I think one of the hardest things to realize as a writer is sometimes trying out those other point of views or writing a scene from another character is a good idea, even if it's not going to be, even if you either know it's not going to be in the book or the story from the beginning, or you find out, like, our brain tells us, well, that was a waste of time trying this other perspective, but it's not, because each of those is part of the steps of learning what was the problem, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's you pressing all the buttons to see what each one does, and once you know what each one does, you can make the machine work, right? And so I've done things where I've swapped POV, and then it turned out I was wrong for swapping POV, but it made me realize something about the agency of a certain character or something like that within a story. So it's not a waste, you know? Even if that scene gets deleted, never sees the light of day, and you remove that character from the book completely, like it will help you in this story, and it will help you later on.
Absolutely.
Yes, sometimes that can reveal a different story that needs to be told. Like when I did my Riders of the Future story, that's a short story, and it's about the cyborg who is, I always call him the cyborg park ranger, and he finds this human girl who's escaped from the citadel that he's watching. At the end of the story, she dies, and it's kind of poignant, and it's told from his point of view. And then a few months after writing that story, it occurred to me, you know, the girl's story is actually a lot more interesting. And if instead of killing her off, I tell that story, I can get a novel out of it. So sometimes that shift in POV actually reveals an entirely different story.
I recently accidentally had to change the point of view of an entire novel because I wrote the first one in first person. I had been working on the second one, but the third one I needed done for a different project because it was coming out in an anthology. And they're novel novella length. They're about 50, 60,000 words, right? And I could have sworn I wrote the first book in third person, but did I bother to go back and look? No. So I wrote the third one in third person. I had written the first one in first person. And the second one, which was 3/4 of the way done, I had to decide if I was going to keep it in first person, which it was written in, or switch it to third. And I ended up deciding that I liked the third person in the third book quite a bit, right? So I went back to change the second book, convert it all the way over to third person. And and I knew this on one level, but I hadn't known it because I hadn't consistently had to do it across an entire novel. It changes the narrative distance that you have with your character, how far inside your head they are. And so when it's in first person, um, you have sort of an immediacy that doesn't necessarily convert to third person, but it can if you're careful. But third person gives you some options in terms of developing the character that first person doesn't. So it allows you a little bit more of narrative telling sometimes to slip that in there. And I liked both versions. Crazy enough, I liked them quite a lot, and it was very difficult to convert from first to third. But in the end, I do like the third person in that second book better than the first person because it allowed me to um, develop the character on a couple different more levels than I had been able to just using first, if that makes sense.
They say with us, like point of view, it's so important for the story because it's like picking the right camera lens to tell the story with. And it really shapes how we tell stories by making those initial, really early decisions of how the character is going to tell the story and who is telling that story.
I think that's a good spot to transition to the last big question I wanted to make sure we got to, which is what the stakes are for that character and how we as writers can make small personal stakes feel meaningful and big save the world type stakes feel personal and important to that character. Let's see, who haven't we started with yet? Let's start with Stuart this time.
Okay. Yeah, it's always ironic that when you tell new writers to begin in media res, they always want to start with a battle, right? And the problem is nobody cares about a battle. People care about people. And the the thing that I think a lot of people miss, or I know I missed, is that it isn't conflict per se that makes a story as much as regret or pinning a character that we identify in a hole where there's no course they can take that's the right course. And it's ironic, the big theme in a lot of the Star Trek movies was the no-win situation, but the no-win situation is exactly what makes the audience care about your character, right? Because if they know what they need to do and they can do it, then they just need to go do it and they either succeed or they don't. But if they don't know what they should do, or if all the choices before them are going to bring a cost that the audience can identify with and doesn't want to see them face, or brings them into conflict with choices they've made in the past that can't be undone. Now you really got the audience by the short hairs, if you will. And I can think of no better example than the Korean drama Crash Landing on You, where the two protagonists are a South Korean businesswoman who, through an accident, ends up in North Korea and falls in love with this North Korean soldier. And like by the end of the second episode, you're sitting there thinking, well, this can't end well because it's not like in America where you can just elope to Wyoming and everything will be cool. If if they end up together, his family in North Korea will pay the penalty. And if she leaves, it's like there's no solution where everybody's going to get what they want. So from the very beginning, you're really roped in.
Lisa, what about you?
Well, I think the my key to telling good stories is creating empathy with the character. So they could be in a world-ending situation, but if they're thinking about, I don't know, the little brother that they left behind that's not going to have anyone to turn to if they die, all of a sudden you don't care about the rest of the world ending. You really want this person to succeed, even in a big backdrop. Um, so I think a lot about the advice that or a comment that some a writer once said, which was all stories are about character death. Like the risk is the character will die, and he didn't mean literally like in a battle. He meant like there's there's a few different deaths, and I don't quite remember everything. There was like one where it's like a death of identity, one where it's like a death of like a future. Like he gave the example of Pride and Prejudice. If they don't get married, they don't have a future. Um, it- like there's a bunch of different deaths. So basically, every story is about uh, some sort of big stake for that character, and the way that those character stakes work for readers is if we kind of create a bridge of empathy between that. Like, it's not enough just to have a battle scene because that's generic. But if you have a battle scene where, like I said, you have a soldier in there who just wants to make it one more day so he can finish that letter home, all of a sudden you have a much more engaging story.
And Diana, how about you?
Well, I think readers kind of the way they enjoy is they live vicariously through the characters, right? And so yeah, creating characters where the situation matters to them personalizes it on every level. So if you're going to have the end of the world, uh, enormous stakes, right? Um, that's you can care about that on a sort of in a sort of a distant way because it's not very personal to you, but you're like, oh, humanity is going to die. It's like kind of trying to contextualize how many people have died of COVID, right? To imagine that number of people isn't very personal, but then you start thinking, okay, well, now you start putting it more context of, well, okay, so that's as many people as would be in my entire city. So what if my entire city was wiped off the map? Or then you can contextualize it even more is with people that have gotten sick or died, or you start doing the Kevin Bacon 6 whatever of removal, and you realize that it's affected a lot of people that right? And that's where it becomes personal. It becomes about how much it matters to you because you care about these people and you want them to be okay, or you think about your children, right, and what they might have to go through, etc. And you can personalize that by putting it in the context of immediacy, right? So then your character experiences of what the end of the world might look like, right? So they might experience like the wiping out of an entire town, right? And they walk into it and they look around and they see, maybe they see a tennis shoe laying there, and then all of a sudden that evokes their own child because their child had a shoe that was just like it, etc. So when you make the stakes personal on any kind of level, it has to matter to that character, and you have to make it um, emotional. I think the stakes always have to be emotional. Um, the character has to care about it, but then on top of that, it has to be more like a punch in the gut to the when they have the risk of losing something or they have the risk of failing at something. It has to be, we all have regrets, and you can say, damn, I wish I'd have done that differently. But this has to be more than that. This has to be, oh my God, if I don't do this, if I do this differently, I'm going to have to live with that loss. As Stuart was saying, and as Eliza was saying, you're going to have this thing that's this hole for the rest of your life that can no longer be filled. And can you live with that? And so there's this constant sort of threat, and that threat constantly to what they could feel. If they died, fine, great, they're done. They don't have to feel that. But if they have to carry that, and I keep thinking, I always think about Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. If you've ever read that, it's about it focuses on the literal things they carry, but it's about the emotional baggage they carry, and those things that they carry are symbolic of that emotional baggage. And you realize as they go along that the things they carry, it doesn't matter when they put them down, they can never put down the things that they will emotionally carry. And that's kind of the way I think all characters should be, that that stakes is about how they're going to have to deal with it forever, for the rest of their lives, and have to struggle with that.
Just one quick correction before we get to Danny. I think it's pronounced Eliza, right?
Lisa,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
That's fine. It happens all the time.
And then Danny, what about you? What about how do you feel about making stakes?
So it's really interesting because I have a different way in prose and comics, and I'm gonna kind of mention the comics one first because I think it's really funny because it almost sounds like it's in direct opposition to everyone, but it's not. So the thing with comics, is that the action and the violence, like in superhero comics or action, comics, all of that stuff that is the climax in a lot of other stories is their norm, right? It is where they start. So like a lot of times, say for example, we give the right critique of say if you're going to start with action, is it possible to make the person care about the action in prose, right? But the part of the reason for that is because so much of what we learn about a character's personality is formed by what their norm is, and then how they react when it's different. For a lot of licensed comics, that means all of that action, how they react in a fight. I thought a lot about critique about the opening scene of Winter Soldier and Falcon, and how it's quote just an action scene. But as someone who like reads comics, what I'm seeing is, oh no, I see his personality in what decisions he makes, how reckless he is, when he's confident enough to snark versus when he's concerned, right? Like those are the standard personality beats. And then you take him out of the harness and you give him an emotional beat, making the action connected to their emotions is the change in the norm. So when you're doing those, the personal is the center in a different way. It's not linking it so much to the larger thing. It's like, oh, now I'm personally invested, not just as I'm a hero and I like saving people, but now this kind of reflects the things that have been going on in my head and I'm not used to that. And so like that's a different kind of construction. So you'll see a lot in comics that you'll just get like pure action or like just a pure wrap up of like what's clearly like a side smaller story. The last couple of what would be the last couple of pages of another story that we're just not going to get into because the way they handle that moment is equivalent to starting with the norm. In like it's like a reverse hero's journey. When I wrote Queen of Bad Dreams, I literally start with her in combat with this really weird creature because the weird creature tells you about the world, but also her like the cleverness of how she solves that is the center of her character in the rest of the story, right? The fact that it's a child, like a child's nightmare monster, is a kind of an important bit. But then on the prose end, I come from like a horror background, and I think that really informs how I write all other genres because I want empathetic, but I want a hot mess as my like lead. All of my characters on a certain level I feel are not literally, but personality wise, the person that you're like, why are you going into the basement? And by that I mean the thing that defines them is like this recklessly being responsible for their own situation, in a way that it's yes, there are the outside forces and those are parts of the theme, but like if a story is going on for me, the impetus or like big plot points will almost always be those moments where you're like, why on earth did you do that? But like, why, because it's the personality. But like and this is like personally for me because I have a lot of feelings about respectability politics and writing brown characters, that like they have to be good in a certain way, they have to be nice in a certain way, they have to be heroic in a certain way. And so for me, I like writing really loud, rude characters, or like the ones who like talk back, the ones who they're talking and they're angry and they're ranting and you're like, you are causing, why are you doing this? And like they're still the hero of the story, but like you don't have to like them. Like and like this is like something that I've come to as stories have gone on. I love writing characters where you want to throttle them literally the whole time.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left, so I think we have time for one audience question, which is convenient since that's, I think, how many audience questions we've gotten. And this is asking real quick how you can enhance the emotion in your characters and stakes, especially if you are not yourself an emotional person. Anyone have anything to speak to that? Danny, yeah.
I still struggle with this, especially in my first drafts. You're being too subtle. By this I mean, we are like, yes, we always have an underlying like emotion or whatever, as people, and we spend a lot of time avoiding saying what we mean. But at some point, especially if it's a character, it leaks out. So if you're struggling to have them move forward, to up the stakes, rewrite that last scene as if they accidentally say exactly what they mean.
Mm.
You know, in that scene where they're arguing because they want to solve, like, because of something internally, accidentally have them say that it's, really about this other emotion. Have the other person, have someone else in the art, in like the discussion, know them well enough to be like, yo, this isn't about what we're about to do. You're still mad about 3 scenes back. Make them confront their stuff, and like this is still, and this is a really good trick if you're not an emotional person too, right? Because just going, have them say exactly what they feel and make people deal with that, as opposed to like fancy like tricks, because we are less honest with ourselves and the world around us than we realize a lot of the time. And people don't always react well to honesty, both the person being honest and the person receiving the honesty. So you can really grow characters by having them be like, I just don't want to do this because I don't like you. Like, you can do a lot of work. And again, even if that ends up not being the way you go, an editor once told me, whenever I work with him, he's just like, be less subtle. Subtlety is earned. If you are really blunt about a bunch of things, you can do a lot of subtle work underneath that and build it. But if you try to be subtle about everything, you lose it.
Anyone else have anything to speak to that about adding more emotion?
I think
Go ahead.
Okay. I think you can add physical reflection of emotion too. I think that's very useful. Whether it can be facial. The one thing I envy about movies or visual is the actors can convey so much with facial expression, right? And as a writer, it's much more difficult to give a facial expression and have it do enough necessarily. But physical responses to emotion work pretty well. And they also can replace dialogue with dialogue tags, which is useful. But you can have somebody who doesn't necessarily show a lot of emotion, um, you know, do something physical that indicates that they are feeling things. Whether or not you articulate what those things are, they may just be having a powerful emotion. And they may be like abruptly walking out of the room non-subtly. But
The Mr. Darcy hand twitch, one of the best moments in any movie of all time, is that close up on Mr. Darcy's hand after, Elizabeth touches him, and you just see it twitch, and you understand exactly what that means. And the stakes are so much higher because you realize he's had an involuntary physical reaction to being tender to her.
right. And see, that's perfect example because just that physical, people identify with that physical emotion and they'll interpret it possibly as more than what you intend it to be interpreted as, or more than you see it, but they will see it as a signal of what it is. And that'll be meaningful, and people will put those puzzle pieces together as they read, and understand that there's emotion happening. And there's a book, what is it, The Emotional Thesaurus or whatever, that will connect emotions to physical, give you ideas of physical responses, which can be very useful if you're having trouble kind of figuring those things out. So that's a good book to kind of look up and see if it'll help.
And I know Stuart had something else to say that we'll get to before we wrap things up. What was that?
Yeah, I was just going to say another thing that can be helpful is like Diana was saying early on about interviewing your characters in their own voices. find somebody either online or in real life to kind of inform that character's voice, because and I don't mean like to copy somebody, but to take the flavor of how they talk. Somebody who's a little bit more effusive than maybe you would be, or you think your character would be, can help add an emotional response to them. And it's important to remember that just as TV presenters always smile bigger and talk more emotively, and YouTubers a little less so, and us here even less so, but prose is not real life. It needs to be a little bigger than real life because it's supposed to be entertaining.
It's easier to tone stuff down. Same editor who told me to be, less subtle. Will always be easier to roll back a scene and make it like more subtle than it will be to take a
Yeah.
subtle scene and make it bigger. And the reason is because when you're editing that scene, you will be a different person in a different place, and it will be harder for you to put what you didn't already put into the scene back into the scene. But
Yeah.
if a scene is too extra, too dramatic, you have all your notes in the scene. You
Yeah.
don't need to recreate what you were trying to do. Where if you're being subtle, there's always a part of you that's like, what was I going for here? Like if a subtle scene doesn't work, you will reread it and be like, I lost the plot. Which true fact, once I did this, where I was like, I have too many characters. I'm gonna pull back this whole novel. And then I got to the big scene of the villain monologue about her logic and her reasoning, and she no longer had a purpose to being a villain because I removed the character that was her emotional core, because I was trying to be more reasonable about the story and be less ridiculous. And it turned out
We
that
love the ridiculous.
and
There
like
you
it's
go.
the sort
Be
of thing
ridiculous.
that because I was being like chiller about the story, I didn't realize until I got to the point where she had to declare it in that story, because in outline form it still worked,
Yeah.
Right.
and it will
We've
always
got, yeah, sorry, we've got 2 minutes left, so I
Yeah.
want everyone to have a second to say where people can find you online, and any big projects you've got coming up that you want to hype. Let us know. Let's start with Diana this time.
Website www.dianapfrancis.com, and I got a number of books coming out this year. Just keep an eye on the website, join the newsletter, and you'll know.
Hey, Eliza.
So you can find me at atgreenblatt.com or on Twitter at atgreenblatt. And I have 3 stories in one Lightspeed, one in Nightmare, one in Asimov's this year, and I have a novelette coming out in tour this September, which I'm very excited about. And yeah, that's what I got so
I'm going
far.
to interrupt and say congratulations on your nominations. I mentioned
Yes.
that earlier, but
Yeah, thank you.
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's
And they are
exciting.
so well deserved. Like your stuff is awesome.
Thank you so much.
Stuart, where can we find you?
I am at cstewarthardwick.com, and I have stories coming out in Analog and Galaxy's Edge. I'm also in the Surviving Tomorrow anthology with Neil Gaiman and a bunch of other big names. And I have a anthology of hopeful, uplifting space adventures with a bunch of award-winning authors called Final Frontier, that's available on Audible.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Danny, how about you?
I am way too much online over at Twitter, weredogs.com, or weredogs.com, weredogs, WEREDAWGZ, because I have a brand to maintain and it's werewolves. Next Wednesday, actually, I have my first issue of Champions number 6 comes out, a whole new arc, as well as Truth and Justice number 3, which is collected my John Constantine story that was digital only, is now available in 1 issue. And also, I'm going to promote this because Amy might not, that right now, Amy has on Fireside a story that I edited that I am quite proud of, and Amy should be too. It's been a long morning, so Deadlock, right? That is the correct title? Yes. It is an amazing environmental sci-fi that I highly recommend.
Thank you. And thank you very much to our audience for bearing with the technical difficulties in the beginning. If anyone wants to continue discussing this, I'm going to drop into the convention lobby Discord channel for a little while. And otherwise, thank you to our panelists and have a great rest of your convention, everybody.
Thank you for moderating.
Bye. Thanks.